Thanks for having me, Becky. It's great to be here. I've been really interested in reduced tillage trials since I was a grad student, and for the last couple of years, as the senior climate and agriculture specialist at American Farmland Trust in New England, I've been working with a number of farmers in Massachusetts and Maine and Connecticut on this project called Farmer-Led Innovations in Reduced Tillage. And we're convening peer conversations about how to reduce tillage at scale. All of these farmers are organic. The average farm is about 35 acres, and they all are currently relying on conventional tillage and looking for ways to make a change. So the primary motivation here for most of these growers is to increase resilience in the face of unfavorable and sort of increasingly variable weather. All the heavy rain events, erosion, soil crusting, lots of stories of people having trouble getting carrots to germinate in July, given the heat or drought or torrential rains that happen every 4 days. And just sort of seeing how folks who are decreasing tillage and increasing their soil health are seeing some increased resilience also in the face of seasonal droughts. But all of these farms are at a scale where they can't really adopt no-till practices. There are some really amazing no-till systems that are out there. The original Rodale roller crimper system. The application of that is really limited. It was developed in a pretty different climate, where you can get cover crops in earlier in the fall, get stronger establishment, and then the timing has to be just right in the spring. It's like it works well under certain circumstances for a couple crops, but in our climate, it's not really an option for most people. And then we have all of these awesome tarping and deep mulch systems that have been developed at a smaller scale, like a 1 to 3 acre scale, and they're brilliant and also too labor intensive and input intensive to really scale up for most of these folks. So the challenge is, at a tractor scale, there isn't a system yet that's in between no-till systems and conventional systems, and how are people working to develop that? So I think that, like, in my mind right here, the tension is like how to balance the benefits of tillage with the destruction that it causes. Like, we all know why tillage is harmful to our soil organic matter. It destroys aggregates, it decreases infiltration, it decreases water retention, compaction, it affects the soil biology, all of these things we know. But we also know that, like, we rely on tillage to, introduce air into the soil to manage weeds. That's, especially for organic growers, is pretty massive. To do bed prep, to reduce compaction, and incorporate materials, fertilizers or compost, or residual crops, mulch. And we also rely on tillage to cycle nutrients, to get oxygen in there, to incorporate lime or whatnot. So in my mind, right, like, the question is, how do we take advantage of the benefits that some tillage can give us? It's not a black and white situation. Where is this gray area where we can see measurable benefits from reducing tillage? And like the primary reason that we're, yeah. So hopefully we'll sort of cover these main things: weed suppression, increasing organic matter. I wish there was a word for, like, not compacting. We always talk about reducing compaction. I was trying to think of a good word, couldn't find one, but and bed prep. So we'll talk about a bunch of examples. And for the growers that I've been working with, these are sort of the strategies that they've been using. So I would say that, like, just backing up one step, the NRCS uses this soil tillage intensity rating, the STIR value, to calculate tillage intensity. So you can look up the equation. I don't think it's all that relevant for this conversation, but I think the idea, right, is you're putting together all these factors of tillage, right? The frequency, the depth, the intensity, and I think what we're trying to do, if we're just reducing tillage, is trying to decrease at least one of those factors, or maybe decrease several of those factors by a percentage. So that might be reducing passes. It might be reducing the intensity by using different equipment. reducing depth. It might be strip tilling to just decrease the surface area that's getting disturbed. And what we've seen is farmers are having success with strategies that often involve rotation. So they're either rotating in with cover crops or doing crop rotation that really makes it possible to reduce tillage. Folks are playing around with using mulch at a tractor scale, which can be tricky to apply, sometimes costly, but there are ways to do it. Strip till, which I think there's a lot of potential for, using controlled traffic to just not compact things quite as much in the first place, so you don't have to use tillage to undo all that damage. And just also increasing days in living cover, which can really benefit the soil overall, and sometimes work to suppress weeds and do everything. So I have a couple of minutes to share all this cool stuff. Won't get to all the details, but my hope is that we can give you some examples, and then if folks are interested in touching base later, we can do that. So my first example is Paul Bucciali at Fort Hill Farm in Connecticut. The example here is reducing frequency of tillage. So Paul uses this reverse flail chopper to prep for cover crop seeding within a week or two of cash crop. So he gets his crop out, he takes this thing in here. It's an old piece of equipment. It's like a reverse action flail mower, not flail mower, corn chopper. So that reverse action sort of sucks up the crop residue and weeds, and he drops the blade basically to the soil surface and is kind of cleaning up after the crop without doing any tillage. And then he immediately goes in there with a no-till seed drill and plants his cover crop. And he's very careful about doing it right after the crop comes out. You get as many days in living cover as possible. And I think that, like, to me, this is an example of how, instead of coming in after a crop, if it's corn, disking a bunch of times, he's just shredding the residue and planting cover crops. So you keep the carbon deposition from the cash crop. You have all those root channels intact. And Paul finds this really drastically reduces his weed pressure the following season and makes a difference in organic matter in his really sandy soil. Seth at Crystal Spring Farm in Maine. He's been working on a number of different strategies over time, strip till using cover crops to suppress weeds. In the last couple of years, he's been playing around most with using his no-till drill to plant oats and in September and October in like 6 sessions. And then in spring, I don't have good pictures of this one, but in spring he goes in and uses a yeoman plow to prep carrot rows for a really early, like May 1st carrot seeding. So that plow just like pushes really light winter-killed oat residue to the side and works really well for carrots. It doesn't work for everything, but early carrots are a major crop for Seth. So that really works for him. He's just plowing this little zone, 3 or 4 rows in a bed, and these are on permanent beds. So he's really reduced his compaction over the years and sees a difference there. So the folks at Goranson Farm are using a softer speed disc to reduce the number of passes. So that's both the frequency of tillage, but also the depth, and also reducing the intensity of tillage type. So they're able to use this piece of equipment to bury cover crop residue, like a significant amount of cover crop residue. If it's a lot, they still have to flail mow the cover crop to reduce the size of that biomass. But if it's sort of a medium amount of cover crop biomass, they're able to incorporate it in 1 or 2 passes. If it's light residue, 1 pass works great. It runs about 3 inches deep, but it creates a really nice level bed. And so they said, unless you have 8-foot tall rye, that will take multiple passes, but most of the rest of it is 1 pass. And so they often come in after this and use a yeoman's plow just to kind of like open up the soil profile, because it's only, they're only getting 3 inches of tillage. But that's still a big improvement when you think about the alternative, because that plow is like, it's just like a shank. It's like very vertical. You're not getting aggregate destruction. You're not getting soil turning. And so all together, they have a seedable beds in 4 passes: the speed disc, the yeoman's plow, fertilizer, and a bed shaper. And that for them has replaced many, many passes with disc harrows and perfectas. Another example of reducing tillage is actually just reducing cultivation. So We have a lot of folks who have plastic mulched beds, tomatoes, winter squash, sometimes sweet corn, and they're having to go into those beds and, run cultivators a number of times all summer long, creating this kind of compacted, dry, dead zone. So this is an alternative. You have more days in living cover. You're getting all that soil improvement in the pathways, and and also kind of awesome rainfall infiltration in the summer. Really significant changes in how water is moving across the surface of those plastic covered fields. And it's also kind of awesome because when you're driving down those beds in the fall, you get much better traction, less mud, easier to harvest. And also folks are reporting that just harvesting in the heat of summer is a lot more comfortable on these living mulch pathways instead of on landscape fabric, whatever people are using. This requires mowing or weed whacking. So you have to be willing to do that, but most people find they can do it every 2 weeks. And I would say the happiest practitioners are the ones who have like a push string trimmer so that they're not using a weed whacker and not using some piece of equipment that is tearing up their beds. The height of the bed makes a big difference here. So if you want to talk details about it, we can do that. I am a big fan of some of the work that Chuck Curry's done at Freedom Food Farm. He's growing sweet potatoes on black plastic with transferred mulch in the wheel track. So the bottom left of the photo, you can see that kind of equipment that he uses to chop and transport the mulch. Other folks are using round bale shredders to deposit mulch, straw between the beds. The benefit right here is that you're not cultivating 20 to 40% of the surface area of that field. And then you also are feeding that soil microbiome and adding organic matter in this sort of passive way that's also reducing your weed pressure. And Chuck is using that, we'll talk a little bit more, but Chuck is using that in rotation. So that mulch is going on to mulch other crops in subsequent years. So it's also being sort of has double use. Oh, that's the next slide. How about that? So in year one, he has these sweet potatoes, and he's kind of growing in these blocks. So it's like sweet potatoes, onions, melons on plastic, harvests those, pulls up the plastic, drills oats, radish, and peas, and then transplants garlic into those living oats, peas, and radish in October. And ends up having to add some leaves in the spring. In year two, at the beginning of year two, because the oats and peas aren't quite enough biomass to mulch the garlic. So once the garlic is harvested, he undercuts it, and then just using those same beds, transplants brassicas into those beds and mulches with some green chop. And then it has this fall harvest of Napa cabbage and kale, and afterwards no-till drills some overwintering cover crop. And then in year three, that overwintered cover crop is used to graze his animals or to harvest for more cover crop mulch in the spring. And that third year is kind of a full season cover crop. So that only works if you have enough land, if you have the equipment to do this. But I really love this idea of using cover crops as a foundation for a rotation and just thinking about how all these pieces fit together. Chuck has really changed how he markets what he grows and how he markets his produce because he can't fit everything into this system. So he doesn't grow a lot of the stuff that he used to grow and has just been able to shift his market. He actually also does like a 2-acre market garden, and that's where he does his lettuce and carrots and tomatoes. But these are the only crops, right, that he's now doing at a tractor scale. But he's figured out a way to create a rotation that really takes advantage of each piece of the puzzle. Our next example is Mike Parashow at Andrews Farm in Maine. He has a smaller, what he's working with is a smaller area. These are 1/4-acre blocks, but I really like how his rotation works. I think it's worth sort of diving into because of that. So in the first year, he's doing tillage. So again, this is like a reduced tillage system. He's starting out by tilling and making beds for peppers, eggplants, and cucurbits. And for weed suppression is using landscape fabric that year. The following year, the landscape fabric comes up and he's putting 2 inches of compost down to suppress weeds on those beds, and no-till transplanting spinach, alliums, and beans. So that's like a block of those 3 crops. And then so that compost overwinters, and in the spring, he's transplanting in lettuce and fall brassicas, and that's what that whole crop block is that year. And then in the fall, planting winter rye, rolling that rye in the fall, and seeding. Oh, I have this backwards. I'm sorry. I got my winter rye like a season off. So year 3, he's actually rolling the winter rye and transplanting the lettuce and fall brassicas into the rolled winter rye. And then in year 4, there's not a lot of rye left after that full season of the rye acting as a mulch. And the weed suppression is just kind of like having not had weeds for 3 years. So the weed suppression in year 4 is for carrots and beets that are direct sown. There's a little bit of rye residue that's left in the walkways, but mostly that year, weed suppression is just because there's not a lot growing. And then he tills that in the following spring and starts the rotation over. And I think that these types of rotations where they take the cover crop really seriously as a tool to do the nutrient cycling and the weed management are something we can really develop. I'm really excited about people who are trying these innovative strip till strategies. So it kind of stacks reduced tillage approaches, right? You're reducing frequency, you're reducing the intensity of tillage type, you're reducing the depth across most of your field, and you're reducing surface disturbance. Doesn't work for every crop, and I think that's what we're finding. None of these strategies work for every crop, but one of these strategies works for every crop. They're just different across the farm. So zone till is, down to like 18 inches. So this is Andrew Woodruff at Island Grown Initiative on Martha's Vineyard. He's doing a ton of different stuff with a lot of support by Lincoln Fishman and Momentum Ag, doing a lot of cool experiments of strip tilling into perennial white clover. They're doing all kinds of trials really around cover crops and reducing tillage. But this photo is of some tomatoes that are planted into clover, and there's a side-by-side control how they usually do it, planted into landscape fabric. They've had really good luck with yields and no problems with disease pressure, and they've also just like really enjoyed working in that clover environment. Andrew's been developing this custom equipment, which is really cool because it's both simple and easy to modify. So you can have you can do 1 row, you can do 4 rows, you can adjust the angle of the discs. Andrew did a webinar that I think is recorded, and we could send out afterwards if people are interested in watching that, talking about how he developed this and how it's been working for him. But I love this idea of like being able to create something using equipment that's not super expensive. You're not bringing in one of those like, 8-row strip tillers from the Midwest. It's really heavy, impossible to pull. This is like a manageable piece of equipment for a lot of folks who are growing vegetables in the Northeast. And you can really grow some beautiful things in there. Atlas Farm is also trying strip till into clover using a more traditional zone builder, and then cultivating. So unlike the Island Grown Initiative trials, which are not relying on cultivation, Atlas felt like they really needed to have the ability to cultivate a zone, in part just because of scale. And so it's been a really tricky process to find effective equipment, and they tried a number of setups after doing the initial zone tillage, trying to maintain them. So they started using like straight coulters followed by a chisel shank. And here you see the 3rd iteration, which is like a couple spider gangs and a rolling basket to break up the clumps and kind of smooth out the strip before transplanting winter squash. And then they ultimately used like 2 hilling discs up front on either side of the chisel to like redefine the edge of the zone and slice the clover that was kind of growing into the strip. So this was really interesting because, in the initial trial felt sort of messy and complicated, but the delicata squash significantly out-yielded the control, which was a real surprise. And this sandy field has now had like a full 1.5 years of living clover and a really productive squash year where 70% of that surface area was covered by cover crop. Oh, I'm running out of time here, so I'm gonna have to skip ahead a little bit.
Okay, Julie, you can
I
keep,
can keep talking.
yeah, keep going.
There's always more to say. So I think that Ryan has presented on these webinars before, but I think I visited his farm last summer, and there's a field walk up there with NOFA Vermont. And I just think that like interseeding is one of those kind of underrated things. Like lots of people have done it for years. It's nothing new, but the folks who are really committing to it, who are cultivating on time and getting something in under an established crop at the last cultivation are just seeing these major benefits. Like it's hard to get in and cover crop in October. You know, you can't cover crop after Brussels sprouts, it's too late. But seeing the real benefits of putting out mostly rye, I mean, mostly clover and some other mixtures. Like sometimes people are trying wheat, even a mixture of wheat and rye and clover. But you get good weed control in the fall and you get good mud control for fall harvest. I admire what Spencer Blackwell's doing at Elmer Farm in terms of controlled traffic. He has this cool system that relies on a lot of like, it must be haylage mulch, that's like spoiled haylage from a dairy farmer next door. So the whole system isn't something that necessarily everyone could replicate, but you can see like real benefits on his farm by only compacting that, 15% of the field that the tracks are on, not having to like till everything to undo that wheel compaction. It also makes strip tillage more doable because you know where you're going, you have sort of a set path. And again, this is like a low-tech way to reduce tillage. And it's manageable, like, lots of folks on a larger scale are using GPS to do this. But it's also like very possible to set it up with, other systems, flags and rocks and whatnot to create these, if you're committed to creating more permanent beds. I think though one of the things that's been really interesting in working with these farmers over the last few years is like just some of the like lessons learned. Folks have had to really reassess their standards. I remember at that Atlas Farm field walk, he was kind of like, I don't know about this. It was August, right? So we're out there looking at the winter squash in these zones, and like the squash are yellower than the control. Everything's a little weedier. It's just like a little more out of control. And he was like, I don't know about this. And then the yield was significantly better, and like 40% better, if I remember correctly. And it had all these soil health benefits. And so I think that like just remembering that like if you're going to try to reduce tillage, it's not going to be the same. It's not going to look as tidy, it might work differently. You might have to just be more uptight about how things are timed, but that by reassessing those standards, it gives you more opportunities. I mentioned a couple times, but like the necessity of doing things in a timely way. I think cover crops are very often, we're not harvesting them and selling them. So it's really hard to prioritize them over a cash crop. That's the truth. But the folks who are really successful in reducing tillage and integrating cover crops are doing it by really valuing those cover crops as part of their cash crop system. And getting the timing right on cultivating and interseeding at the right time, which is usually earlier than you want to. And then removing barriers to cover crop. I mean, just watching farmers using no-till seed drills, it's like, I just wish everyone had one. And I think everyone deserves one. It just makes it so much easier. But if there are ways, if you don't have a drill, if there are ways to reduce barriers to cover crop seeding by, keeping your mixture mixed and in a bin so it's ready to go, or just making the equipment easier to use somehow, I think that really enables success. And then the other thing is to like define success. I've noticed that people try these trials and they're like, ugh, it was weedy, I don't know. But unless you actually measure something, whether that's like how much time you're spending on it or what your yield is, you don't actually know, because things can look, this is the photos here are a good example at Island Grown Initiative. Broccoli was super weedy. It looked like a mess. They were like, this is not going well. And in the end, they had a really great crop, and it pulled through. And so I think knowing what you're going to define your success on is important. having patience, having a backup plan if things don't go well. Like, are you going to go back in? Do you have some cultivating equipment that you can go back in there with if things get really out of control? But I think having a backup plan can make that the discomfort of trying something new a lot better. And then there's also just like a little bit of stubborn determination that's required. Like it never works the first time. This is like most of the folks that I've been working with have been trying stuff for years, and every year something works and something doesn't, and it's just a continual effort to make it work, because the benefits are really there. So I just want to like give credit to all these amazing farmers that have been part of this for the last few years, in Connecticut and Maine and Massachusetts. And um, Lincoln and I, Momentum Ag and I are starting a sort of email group for folks who are at tractor scale and wanting to talk about reduced tillage. So it'll be a combination of the living clover mulch folks that Lincoln works with and the sort of larger reduced tillage group, not larger, but the slightly different reduced tillage groups that I've been working with. But we want to have a space for folks to talk about equipment and timing, because it seems like those are the things this all hinges on. So if you'd like to join that group, which should be getting started in early April, please email me and we'll put you on the list. And we'll also be having a bunch of field walks this summer, and we'd love to hear your experiences too.
Thank you, Julie.
Thank you.
What an amazing summary and photo array, and great work that you're doing. Thank you. And Lincoln, thank you for joining us too. He's here from Momentum Ag. I want to move along to Natalie. There are some questions in the chat that maybe you could answer, Julie, and then we'll have time for conversation after. So I want to give Natalie plenty of time, but I'm glad you completed your slides because it was all really wonderful. And I'm sorry I didn't cover this earlier, but we put questions in the chat, or we'll have time at the end. So Natalie, if you want to add any introduction to yourself that I missed, but thank you so much for joining us. And
thank you for that awesome setup, Julie. And so I also want to let people know that I'm giving essentially a condensed version of the talk that I gave at the New England Vegetable and Fruit Conference. So if you saw it there and you don't want to see it again, I will not be offended if I see people dropping out of the talk. Just heads up. So yeah, I'm Natalie Lounsbury. I work at UNH as a research professor, and I have been interested in cover crops and reduced tillage for a very long time, since I was farming, really, when I saw kind of what happens when we till the soil a lot and then we get a big rainstorm. So today I want to talk a little bit about kind of choosing things to consider when you're considering what sort of cover crop and reduced tillage system might work for your farm, and acknowledge that it is a balance between making money and prioritizing your ecological goals, and that I myself don't currently make any money farming anymore. So that's where I'm coming from. So yeah, choose your own adventure. It really is a lot about, hold on, I gotta move this so I can actually see my slides. Union of your economic and ecological goals. So what you have going on. There is no single way to do it. And so that was really great to have Julie talk about all the different ways that people are approaching reduced tillage on their farms, given their circumstances and what they like. So yeah, the context of your farm and your personality. I think that's really important. Like, I always think about how I've spent the other day, actually yesterday, I was folding a tarp with my husband because we moved some leaves, and I was like, I have folded so many tarps in my life. Like, do I like this? No, I don't. I am sick of folding tarps. So yeah, your personality, what you like to do, really matters. So this sort of this isn't really philosophizing, but thinking about the relationship between yield and ecological sustainability, it is unfortunately negative. We cannot have all things. We cannot have high yield and high ecological sustainability. So you can either have high yielding systems that are not particularly sustainable, or sustainable systems that are not particularly high yielding. That's not to say, though, that we can't move more in the sustainable direction. So I think that is our goal. However, to achieve the maximum yield, we often have high inputs, and that means fertilizer. And I include compost here. There's this, I'm very supportive of the small scale no-till movement that uses a lot of compost, but I do want to acknowledge that that is an often external input, and it is loaded with nutrients. So also water and external inputs for pest management and weed management. And that can lead to high externalities. So nutrient runoff and leaching, chemical runoff, microplastic pollution, soil loss, wah, wah. I know it's kind of a downer. But so you end up with these, you can kind of divide it into these four quadrants. You have the high yield, low ecological sustainability systems. You've got low yield, high ecological sustainability systems, like maybe, you know, perennial grains that some research are working on. You have low yield, low ecological sustainability. Those are sort of, why would you bother? You don't want to be working in that system. And then we're all working towards this high yield, high ecological sustainability, rainbows and unicorns. That's really where we want to be. Minimizing those inputs, minimizing those externalities, but still getting high yields and supporting ourselves economically. So, do nothing scenario. If you know, with climate change, some of these high yield, low sustainability systems, they are probably going to move down on the yield. And so they're going to move into an area where it's really just, why bother? But if we can make some of these high yielding systems more sustainable, get closer to those rainbows and unicorns, or if we can make some of these sustainable systems higher yielding, then we're moving in the right direction for agriculture. So I'm going to focus on making high yielding systems more sustainable. So again, that means reducing the inputs and reducing the externalities. And a big way or a great way to do that is with cover crops and reduced tillage, for some of the reasons that Julie talked about. But with these systems, there are trade-offs, and I am going to talk today about kind of some different systems. Not going to get into the details of them because Julie did a great job with that. But when we talk about cover crops and no-till, there are so many different systems. So there's the roller crimper, the high residue systems, and those can be with or without legumes. There are also the low residue systems like tillage radish. There's rotational no-till where you do occasionally till. There's continuous no-till. There's tarps, there's herbicides. I don't even have interseeding on here, which was really cool to hear about all the interseeding projects that farmers are doing. So what is the context of your farm? And I'm going to talk about the weeds, soils, climate, and then just a little bit about philosophy. So weeds, I think I could have done this whole talk plus, 3 more hours on weeds. But I do not think you can understate the importance of understanding who's there and how many are there, before you get started with any kind of reduced tillage, especially organic reduced tillage and cover crop based reduced tillage. So this is a picture of Rich Smith and technician doing the germinable seed bank assay, which is where you take a soil sample, you put it in a tray, mix it with potting soil, and you germinate, you water it, and you germinate those weeds again and again and again. It goes on for weeks, and you count every single weed that comes up, and then you pull it. So you count it, you say, okay, this week there was 5 red root pigweed, blah, blah, blah. So over the course of this, you, in theory, get a good sense of what's in the seed bank. That doesn't necessarily mean that's what's going to show up in the field, but it is a good assay of the potential, what's there. There isn't really research for specifically New England and specifically vegetable production, but in grain production systems in the Mid-Atlantic, they have found that it is imperative to have less than 10,000 germinable weed seeds per square meter. Just to give you a baseline of what these numbers mean, before implementing cover crop based no-till. And that's just because the power of the cover crop mulch is great, but it is only so great. And if there are more than 10,000 weed seeds, then they will find those little microsites to germinate and come up, and you will have a weed problem. So several years ago, my colleagues went and they sampled 22 organic farms in vegetable farms in New Hampshire. Other folks did it, I think, in Maine and Vermont as well, but I have the data for New Hampshire, and they found that there were very few farms that, so on the y-axis we have the number of farms that fall into each of these ratings of how many germinable seeds there are per square meter. So very few of the farms actually were under 10,000. Most of the farms were well above 10,000, with I think one farm being way above 10,000. So all of these organic farms are kind of starting off at a baseline that they're really not ready to implement cover crop based no-till, at least the sort of high residue mulch based no-till. So they need additional weed control. Yeah, so 4 farms were under 10,000, 18 farms were above 10,000. As context, I know everyone or many people have heard of the Nordells in Pennsylvania. Eric Gallant at UMaine sampled their fields and found that the average for them was 500 and the maximum was 1,500. So I know these numbers, when you're introduced to something new, it's like, I don't know what that number means, but hopefully I've given you some context for you know, sort of a farm that has really prioritized drawing down that weed seed bank versus the rest of us. Yeah, so most organic farms in New Hampshire need to either deplete or bury the weed seed bank before cover crop based no-till, or they need additional weed suppressive tools, whether that's tarps, herbicides, or additional mulch to augment cover crops. And when I say additional mulch, it could be like the picture that Julie had of spreading haylage or something of that sort. And I also just want to say those are just numbers of weed seeds, but community really does matter. So here is a picture of one of those trays. I don't know where this sample was taken, but you can really see that this particular community is not very diverse, but it's also very representative of a lot of vegetable farms with those summer annuals, red root pigweed, crabgrass really dominating the community. And so you want to target your specific weed community with whatever rotations and cover crops you are using. Moving on to soils. I'm remembering how weird it is to give a webinar. I haven't done this in a really long time, and I like can't see anyone and just talking into the ether. So soils, it's important to think about the, oh, hey, Lincoln. think about the innate characteristics and the history of your farm. So sandy soils are definitely easier to switch without any physical constraints than heavier clay soils. Some soils you really may need to work to improve the tilth or the soil health, whether it's because of their innate characteristics or because of their management history. They've been really beat up with time. And then there are some soils that are just marginal, like you probably do need to think about a higher input system, like a compost-based system to really kick those soils into a productive space. Like not all soils, especially in New England, were made to be highly productive agricultural soils. So before you even get started farming, soils is definitely the number one thing to think about. But if you're already there and you're trying to figure out how to make it work, how to reduce tillage, then thinking about what kind of soils you have is important. Finally, climate. Or can we do that here? And I want to draw people's attention to this climate smart farming tools from Cornell. It's fun. You can kind of spend too much time on playing around on the website, but it's another cool tool that, and so I'm going to introduce another unit here. We talked about the weed seeds, and now we're going to talk about thermal units. So getting your mind to think about things instead of planting dates and days to maturity, but thinking about them in terms of heat units and how long it takes to grow something with a given within a given temperature constraints. So this is this is from one of a paper that I wrote on tarping cover crops and growing cabbage. And it's like real Captain Obvious statement, but yet I think it's important to state it. So thermal units are limited in northern climates and can be used for cover crop production, tarping, or cash crop production. Any activity that takes thermal units away from cash crop production can be viewed as an opportunity cost and must provide additional benefits that compensate for this cost. Right, like I said, Captain Obvious, you all know that, but I just want to frame this conversation about, can you implement these high intensity cover cropping systems? Because as Julie said, you can't go halfway with a lot of these. Like you really have to be committed to implementing the cover crop based system so that the cover crop can do what it needs to do. So do you have the thermal units that work with your production system? What are the cash crops that you're trying to grow? And so you can go onto that website and you can plug in your location and you can plug in different dates so you can get historical data for, you know, what it looked like 10 years ago. And then it will give you a prediction for when you might hit a target. So I think I put in the target of 800 degree days. That's a base 47. And the target was reached in this Vermont town end of June. I hit 800. And 800 was intentional because that sort of ballpark what you might need to grow a really good winter rye cover crop, like to really put on that biomass. Vetch, on the other hand, is gonna need maybe even a little bit more. So I think of vetch as target around there, but maybe even closer to 1,000 to get to when it's like really flowering and putting on that biomass. So yeah, you're not going to hit that target we didn't hit that target until the end of June. You can see that this was a particularly warm season compared to the 15-year average or even the 30-year average. But you can also see here that the total growing season in this area is just over 2,400 growing degree days and less than 2,400 in an average year. So you've got to divide those 2,400 between any spring growing that you need for that cover crop, any summer for your crop, and then any fall growing for your subsequent cover crop if you're growing a fall cover crop. So again, getting back to what Julie was saying, interseeding is really nice because you can seed it while your cash crop is still in the ground and take advantage of some of those growing degree days. I was curious how much information there is about vegetable production and growing degree day models. So there has been some work, and I think things are moving in that direction so that, you know, when you look at a seed catalog, it's someday we'll get to the point where it doesn't say 67 days to maturity. It'll give you maybe a little bit better sense of the actual heat units required. We're still not there, I think, but again, this is just something to be thinking about. So to compare different sites, I plugged in Maryland. Again, like that roller crimper system was developed in Pennsylvania, Maryland, the Mid-Atlantic, Vermont, Rhode Island, and Maine. When we hit that target 800, May 15th, June 27th, June 15th, June 25th. So in New England, we are kind of hitting it all right around the same time. In Maryland, they're hitting it way before we are. But then the real thing here is just those total growing degree days. In Maryland, they have 5,300 growing degree days. So almost twice as much as what you folks in Vermont have to play with, and still quite a bit more than Rhode Island and Bowdoinham, Maine as well. So can we afford to use these precious thermal units for cover crops? And again, it's up to you. Like if you feel that the benefits outweigh the costs, then that's your call. Like what do you gain in weed suppression? What do you gain in soil health, erosion prevention, etc.? So it comes down to sort of philosophy. We all make judgments, and I think it's important to have like not a judgment-free zone, but I was trying to think of how to characterize this, and everything I could come up with was like, we all suck. Like we all, you know, like we all pick one vice or another, like pick your poison. Either it's herbicides or it's this. And I was like, well, that's a terrible framing. But it kind of is like we all have to make concessions because we do not have a perfect sustainable system. And so I think it's important for us to be able to talk about what those concessions may be. You know, some farmers may choose that herbicides are what they feel most comfortable with to be able to facilitate a cover crop based no-till. Other folks may decide, well, I am going to use more compost, recognizing that it has some drawbacks too. So I think as long as we are all working towards rainbows and unicorns, we may make different decisions about the path that we choose. But I think cover crops can be a great tool as long as we dedicate enough degree days to them and the management that they really require. Treat them like we treat our cash crops, and then we recognize that we may need judicious use of additional inputs, whether that's herbicides, tarps, or fertilizers to make up for some of those nutrients that may be immobilized in our cover crop based system. And then as part of a rotation that targets your specific farm's weed issues or markets or whatever it is. Again, it's really like choose your own adventure. No two farms are the same. So, and no two people are the same. So that's what I've got. And thank you for listening.
Thanks, Natalie. I guess the question is, are any two unicorns the same? That was wonderful. I really love thinking about cover cropping in terms of those kind of like parameters and trade-offs. It's a really cool way to frame it. We have time for questions and conversation. Anybody want to speak up and ask questions of either Julie or Natalie. And thank you, Julie, for answering a bunch of stuff in the chat already. Or Lincoln, if you have anything to add too, I know you're sitting there probably trying so hard not to jump in, but. And the other thing I did want to mention, I was remiss at the beginning to say this, but we have on April 9th, a dedicated session on living mulches that Lincoln and Ash and Jason Lilly, Ash is from Hurricane Flats and I think is here today, and Jason Lilly from University of Maine is going to talk about. So interseeding and living mulches are going to be the focus of that webinar.
Well, I'll just say
Martha's
that
asking for
I
contact.
got excited about using growing degree days more and talking to people and thinking about it. It's like something, that you observe and something, that farmers have been talking about. They're like, how come the roller crimper doesn't work here? I mean, it's like so frustrating, right? And but when you look at those numbers, you're like, oh, well, that's why right there. And but it'd be so cool if we could use that in more of our analysis of like why certain cover cropping strategies work in certain locations and not in others. And also just thinking like, why don't seed companies use that? Like, it's like much more useful information. Anyway.
And also, I think too, maybe Natalie, you can speak to this, but I've always linked it to with the biomass accumulation. So when you're thinking about like winter rye as a suppressive cover crop, like, isn't it like something like 4 to 6 tons per acre in the mid-Atlantic and maybe like 2 to 3 tons per acre of biomass? Like, it's like, those growing degree days translate not just into a shorter season, but less biomass accumulation, which is less like weed suppression.
Yeah, I think definitely, I think we need more regional models. So there is less biomass accumulation, but also folks have found that we actually need less biomass. Like on the plus side, we need less biomass to have a weed suppressive system. So like, they're saying you need 8,000 kilograms per hectare of rye biomass in Pennsylvania, but folks in like Maine and Canada are finding that we need like 4 to 6. So it's not necessarily that these systems 100% aren't going to work, but we need more regionally adapted understanding of how to implement it.
I'm thinking that'd be a great thing for like Lincoln, is you're kind of like collaborating with data. That would be really cool to kind of have anecdotal connections with like, okay, we had this many growing degree days, but we had really good weed suppression with this cover crop.
Yeah, because the cover crops respond to growing degree days, but so do weeds. So the weed intensity in Maryland is very different than here.
And pests.
Yeah, growing degree days are also super helpful for pest models. And so that's something that can be predictive and useful if folks are trying to scout and understand when something might become a problem.
I mean, I can talk and talk always, but I don't need to say anything.
You got 3.5 minutes.
I guess one thought from both of these, Emily Landeck, who was at Riverland and is now at Hampshire, said something in a meeting we had recently. It was just kind of an aha moment for, I think everybody was like, cover crop seeding dates should be on your cash crop seeding spreadsheet. It's like so obvious. But I think all the things we're talking about is just really valuing them as kind of the basis of rotations or weed suppression, like whatever it is we're hoping that they're going to do. We need to give them the same kind of priority that we give to, no one forgets to plant fall carrots, but people forget to plant a fall cover crop on time frequently. So it's just kind of the simplest, I just have been thinking about that a lot. Because it's so simple, but it's like, yeah, just that's the first thing you can do to value this, is to like actually put it on your spreadsheet, the same spreadsheet that you're going to be looking at all season long when you decide whether, when to plant all your cash crops.
Yeah, I love that too. Like the some of the farms Julie was talking about too, how it's used very deliberately as like framing the rotation. So not just like built into that, but really the architecture of the cash crop rotation is related to that cover crop timing. And I think it's like almost like flipping the narrative where it's like, well, again, like back to that benefit analysis that Natalie is talking about, like if you can articulate the benefits and understand where they're more important than other things, and then build out the cash crop planning from that. I think it's just a really cool and like hard way to think about it, but
Right, it takes more work to figure out how to fit it together, but like Lincoln saying, like once that cover crop fits in, once that's an essential part of your cash crop production, it's like you're not going to forget it because you need that, fall planted radish oat pea mix in order to make your next season carrots work right. And so it becomes a system that feels less like there's tension between your cash crop and your cover crop, and more like there's some unity.
Yeah,
Well,
I think the same
yep.
thing has been true across a lot of farms that are reducing tillage, both with, I think, Natalie, your point about weeds is really, really important. I think even people with high weed seed banks have options, but not the same set of options. And I'm seeing, yeah, I mean, there's a few farms where it's kind of like, I think you need to spend a couple years cleaning up really seriously before we talk about doing some of these wackier things. And it feels disappointing to say to people. But it's also we want everybody to be successful too, and it does feel like a first thing. And then and I'm terrible about this on my own farm, but the like controlled traffic, I just feel like the people who are doing the best job that I'm seeing have just instituted control traffic in one way or the other and are really sticking with it. And I think it just opens up so many other opportunities to do this stuff. Figuring out how to do it is different. Like I said, I'm not even doing it at my home farm. But it's another like sort of common thread, I think, for a lot of people anyway who are having success with this. Yeah, kind of getting those. I think those are kind of like the three pieces that need to be in order before you start getting really tricky. So it's like weed suppression, an idea about controlled traffic anyway, or a theory about where you drive when, and then just taking the cover crop seriously.
Great. Well, this is a teaser, Lincoln, because you're you get a lot more time on April 9th. Next week it's also soil. This is kind of a mini 3-part soil series with these webinars. Next week, we're talking about moving water out of the fields with Joshua Faulkner, who's a soil and climate professor with UVM Extension. He's amazing if folks haven't heard from him, and Hannah Doyle from Boneyard Farm. And then on April 9th, we get to hear from you, Lincoln, and as I mentioned, Ash and Jason Lilly. So really great sequence coming up. You have one more thing to say?
I do, which is the day before that webinar, we're doing another webinar with Bob Schindelbeck from Cornell. So if anyone on the call, and we're going to be really like asking him all those questions about like what a cash test means and how those numbers are derived. So I think my guess is there's a bunch of people on this call who've done some cash testing and are sort of like staring at it like how do I interpret?
So if you can like pop that in your contact in the chat, and then I'll add it to when we send out the recording from this webinar so people can actually see that, that'd be awesome. April 8th webinar and your email. That'd be great. And we'll send out this recording and slides. And thanks, Lincoln. That's great.
Yeah.
Oh, so it's a CISA event. Awesome.
I think
Yeah.
and then Jason and I are going to do interseeding, moving sort of into living mulch together on the 9th, right?
Thank you. Yep. Great. Natalie and Julie, thank you for such fantastic presentations. Really awesome work you both do. Big fan. And look forward to hearing more. Have a great afternoon, everyone.
Hi, thanks everyone.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.